I'm Alex Tudor.
I'm Desiree Hunt Bennett.
Cameron Hopper.
Madeline Neal.
This is our discussion.
Yay. Okay.
Who wants to go first?
Do you have the
So,
questions or just the answers? I guess I can pull up the questions.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so the first question is, why have Native women been historically targeted for sexual violence?
The answer that I kind of found in the reading was that it's because of their ability to reproduce. They want to kind of, it seems like, get rid of the nation as a whole. So in order for them to do that, they were historically targeted by like limiting their reproduction.
I would have to agree with that.
mhm.
I also found a quote on, I think, page 10 where they were talking about because the Indian bodies are dirty, they're also inherently rapeable. So that kind of goes in hand with what you were saying about their ability to reproduce.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I had found a quote, it's on page 21. It says that Native women can be seen as a strategy of white men to maintain their control over white women. So if you are controlling one population, you can control another population, especially in terms of race.
I think I talked about in that question, I know another question focuses on it, but the idea that if their body, if the like Native people and Native women's bodies are seen as violable and rapeable, then so is their land, and that's really what we were after at the end of the day, was we wanted to be able to take their land without each other thinking that we're doing some terrible thing. So if you dehumanize the people that live there, then the land is up for grabs.
Right.
For sure. We got any other comments on this question?
This one, I think, was one of those questions where it was pretty briefly answered
Yeah.
compared to the other ones.
It was mostly talked about in chapter 1.
Yeah,
Which, I mean, kind of mentioned like throughout the book, but then not really mentioned again.
Yeah.
So it was kind of just like inherently you know that that's what it is.
That was kind of like the broad topic
Yeah.
of the book, I feel like, and then each chapter after that delved into a more
Right.
specific aspect of
Right.
I just thought it was interesting the way they were targeted for sexual violence because I remember it said on page 80 that people of this time would have rather raped, tortured, and killed a woman of color or a Native woman before letting them reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And it wasn't even completely about like stopping them from reproducing, because like she said, like when she was a rape counselor, a lot of the Native women that she dealt with told her that they don't want to be Native anymore, so that kind of destroys the culture and the people without even having to kill or stop a child from being born if they voluntarily give up their culture.
I actually put that for one of these other ones.
like later in the, I think it was for question 6 or 7, talking about how
Yeah.
like once you're able to do away with how people reproduce, you do away with the people.
Right.
Like it stops there at reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
Any more on number 1?
I think we're good. Okay.
So what are some examples of the state-sponsored forms of sexual violence, particularly in the form of racist reproductive policies?
Well, I'll start with this one. What was most concerning was how they dealt with birth control, and especially the Depo-Vera, I think that's how you say it, and how even now we know that that's not safe, and we know that it's not good for you, and it has been linked to cancer. And even when it came out, they knew that, and they still kind of made Indian women do it anyway, which it caused a lot of problems. Like a lot of them became infertile because of it, and the state didn't really care. So
I was particularly horrified by the part where they were telling, or they weren't telling, they were the lack of telling women that hysterectomies were irreversible.
yeah,
It seems, that's something you should make more than a parent before going into that.
especially younger
Yeah.
girls too, like 16.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought the threat that was given to the woman in California was interesting. That she could either go to prison or get the Norplant. I thought that was kind of
I like
harsh.
how choice was in parentheses.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember it stating that it kind of all points back to the bankruptcy of the choice paradigm because they were kind of not giving them a choice. And then they made it to where a lot of programs would pay for the sterilization. So, yeah.
I wrote about the same thing as Maddie did with the Depo-Provera shot, how even though they tested it on animals and it proved to have links to cancer of the breast and uterus, that they still, the FDA passed it a couple years later or 10 years later. And even with the Noraplant too, like they kind of gave it to the women without their consent and without giving like the full disclosure of the side effects. And when the women were experiencing the really terrible side effects, like they would try to get it taken out and the doctors would refuse, like, this is why you're having the problems.
Right. And a big issue with that is doctors that were with that program would learn how to implant it but not know how to take it out. So I can just imagine women trying to like scrape it out of their arms.
Yeah, I was
And
doing
just,
the same thing.
Like, I mean, I've seen people do that in real life now. In 2017, people are doing that still. And I mean, they compared them to beagles and how you're obviously not a beagle, so how could this happen to you? Like, you're not going to get cancer just because a beagle got cancer. It's like, but
It's very insensitive.
yeah, like,
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
No, I think we're pretty much
I
the same.
I was gonna say, when it started talking about how like a lot of the programs will pay for the sterilization, but then not abortions, at first I was like,
Yeah.
why? Because I would assume that they, they'd be perfectly fine with that as long as there's not another generation. And I thought it was really like darkly interesting that they were using it as like a fear tactic, that you won't be able, once you get pregnant, you won't be able to get rid of the child, so you might as well just like make sure that you're not gonna get pregnant. And I was like, wow, that's cleverly disgusting.
But not a lot of natives and stuff on welfare and didn't have the money, so it's like you said, they would rather them just, instead of paying for abortions, let's just go ahead and pay for this one-time hysterectomy.
Which they never explained to it. Like, some people don't even know what a hysterectomy is.
Yeah.
And especially young, and we have to imagine that the schools that they're going to are probably not very well funded. They probably don't have a sex ed program. They have no idea what a uterus is, a vagina is, for
How
that
any of that
matter.
works.
No idea. And so they're going in and these doctors are like, this is really good for you. It'll solve all your problems. And they're like, okay, because they're trusted. And they get this thing and it's like, now we can't have kids.
Typically trust medical professionals.
Yeah.
Typically, yeah.
Typically.
I forgot to include a part where like the frequency and like the quantity of the mass hysterectomies, like the doctor discovered that about 50% of the native community this had happened to, and it just was like a huge, it was just disgusting, like scientific experiment almost.
Give me a lot of white guilt reading this.
Yeah.
Extreme white guilt.
I know I don't have to apologize, but I feel like I should.
Well,
Yeah.
because this reading was especially targeting people of color. It didn't matter that they were Native American; they could have been black. they
Yeah,
could
no,
have been
yeah,
Hispanic,
that
they
did
were
talk to me.
definitely-
Yeah,
Yeah,
made
so
that
it was like
apparently.
it's like being white. You have a privilege.
My favorite terrible thing was the crack, the program, how they
Yeah.
like they thought they were
Yeah.
being funny or something, and they purposely misspelled community to make this acronym happen. I was like, you're not funny.
They thought so.
I think it's especially funny that we read this right when Columbus Day is coming up. It's just like,
Yeah. Oh,
it's not.
I was telling my grandma, I'm like, Columbus Day is like terrible, and she's like, well, I want the day off, so I don't really care. I'm like, okay. Okay. So the third question.
Let me get back to it. It is, how have colonizers used sexual violence as a primary tool of genocide?
I think that one and the first one.
They kind of went hand in
Yeah,
hand.
because they were both from the same chapter. Like chapter 1 was literally called like Tools of Genocide or something. So it's basically what we talked about, like dehumanizing them and making them not as valuable to destroy their culture. You good?
You're good.
Oh, okay.
I was myself trying to find out. Well, I know it was stated that they were like a present absence, and they described the absence as being a conviction that Native people are vanishing, and they were kind of like, it's like they were there, but then they were keeping them from reproducing, so it's kind of like they weren't there. And Christian colonizers, okay, that's where I was getting to. Christian colonizers looked at it, looked at Native people as biblical Canaanites, they had mentioned, which is worthy of mass destruction. Like that's kind of the way they looked at them, that they shouldn't reproduce. It's destruction to, yeah.
And it's just as much the state too, like not even trying to hide what they're trying to do, because there's that whole part about the Secretary of the Interior calculated how much it would cost to wage a campaign against them, and was like, no, this is the best way to destroy them as opposed to conflict.
I think when I talked about this, I went back to how the Native bodies were inherently rapeable and how they were treated with such disrespect, on how they were kind of cut open and they took their wounds and stretched them over their hats and just kind of like displayed their parts as like a trophy. Yeah, and I just thought that was very disrespectful. It's like, this is what we're capable of, and you know.
It's gross. Page 26, it talks about, it says, white colonizers who raped Indian women claim that the real rapists were Indian men. So, that didn't make any sense. So, just, the white men will never be blamed.
Yeah.
Like, no white person can do anything wrong, especially in the times when we were, colonizing, and how there was this like mass influx of rape and murder, but the white people couldn't do anything wrong. So we see that, and even still today, Indian men are looked at as rapists and alcoholics and criminals,
Which is crazy, because when
they didn't do anything.
compared statistically, like, there was, 6 reported rapes in the Indian Native American community, where compared to like the spike from when the colonizers just kind of joined.
I like the 70% of tribes didn't conduct warfare until we showed up, and even those that did played it more like a contact sport, like we do football.
Yeah.
That I never heard that, so that blew me away. I was like, really?
And when they did do war, it wasn't like what we think of it. It's just like completely different.
I think another way was making the natives feel self-hatred. Like, after, it's easier to get them to do the sterilization processes and all of the other things and take their land when they start feeling self-hatred, like they're not worth much. And I think the colonizers did a pretty good job of making them feel like they're not worth anything.
Just to add one more point, I think it talks about in the reading that Native Americans normally don't fit into gender roles. They don't conform to specific gender roles, so there are more like feminine and masculine roles, but it's not really like dictated who will do what.
Yeah.
So I think people, especially American people, see that as a threat, and so it's like, okay, we have to hurt the people that are not like us. And so it's just kind of this whole mentality, especially after 9/11 too, when especially Muslim people and just people of color in general are looked at in a way different light. So we're going to be more violent towards them because we don't know anything about them. But any other thoughts?
Next one. I know.
What time did you start?
3:45. It's
been 15 minutes.
I think we're doing nice. How have boarding school policies contributed to the rates of sexual abuse? This one was
Really particularly rough.
We could talk about this for
this had a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, right off the bat, the story about how they knew the applicant had a history of sexual abuse when it came to children. It was like, that's fine, whatever. It's fine. What does he do? Molest children.
Well, I think I was about to say, just allowing them, knowing that the children are being sexually abused and just allowing it to happen was kind of disturbing in its own way. And the government, they eventually tried to come up with healing programs for the victims to try to get them back right, but it's like that wasn't.
You can't really come back.
It's like
it's a very traumatic thing to experience as a tiny person.
Especially in school. I think it leads to the self-hate thing that I mentioned too, when they start feeling like they're not worthy.
I talked about how they were just hundreds and hundreds of children were forced in these conditions, and they were stricken with like overcrowding and disease, so that just kind of contributed to like just the weakness, and because there was an abundance of kids, the likelihood for abuse was increased.
Well, it's that they died all the time.
And
kids would die at school.
And they would just kind of like throw them in the
baffling, thinking of the school experience that we've had, that you die because you're at school. It's crazy.
Yeah, because
Just to add on, it was saying that a lot of the kids mimicked abuse. So they were, especially by someone that's supposed to be an authority figure. That's crazy to me. They were, kids were harming kids. They didn't see anything wrong with it. They were like, oh, this is just whatever.
How it is now.
Yeah, and they didn't really mind. And so a lot of the kids that would end up in those boarding schools would end up being criminals. And they would be doing stealing and hurting people and all that and abusive relationships and things like that. So
And then that allows us to turn around and say, see,
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. We blame them, even though it was our fault.
nobody stole them from their parents and made them
Right.
like this way.
Because we made boarding schools because we wanted to
To civilize.
we wanted to civilize Native Americans.
Mhm.
But
Kill the Indians, save the land.
So in the process, still degrade them
mhm.
and make them feel worthless so that when they are done with school or whatever, they understand that they're not worth anything and that they don't have the right to
Right.
land and all those other things.
There was one more point that I was gonna bring up was since the beginning of the colonization, like assimilation schools, which was in the 17th century, there wasn't laws to protect the children up until 1989. And there wasn't enacted by legislation until 1990. So you had all that time in between to allow all that kind of
Right.
abuse to happen.
One of the other things that was kind of troubling, it was saying that young women who had histories of sexual assault, abuse, and suicide attempts were put into solitary confinement.
Yes.
So, like, I feel now we know solitary confinement is not helpful in any kind of way.
No.
In no way. It helps nobody. And so putting these, especially suicidal, which is like a very big deal, why would you put them by themselves, and like kids who are probably then being abused more, and just, obviously these boarding schools were not very helpful, but it's just kind of messed up.
Does anybody else want to say anything? There was a part, I don't remember exactly where, but they were saying like, our goal is to kind of kill the Indian culturally,
Mhm.
and not or the genocide of Indian culture is more easy and affordable than the genocide of the actual
Yeah.
people. But it seems like either way they'd be fine. Like we don't care if these hundreds of kids die. It's kind of doing us a favor anyways.
They're just trying to find the most cost-effective way
Mhm.
to do this. It was like $1,300 to educate a kid, like
Mhm.
K through the equivalent of K through 12 back then, and then it was like 33 million to wage war. So it's like, well, this is more
Right.
effective. Let's just do this.
It almost seems like they were putting them
It
in
was
these
very-
situations obviously on purpose.
Right,
It's
yeah.
very meticulous and thought out.
Well, because no one would think that you're doing war in school. Like, no one's going to
Yeah.
think, oh, you're going to bring them in school and
Yeah.
you're basically going to kill them all off. No one's going to think that.
From the outside, it looks very
Right.
nice. You know, you're trying to educate all these
Educating
kids
them, yeah.
for basically free. You know,
Mhm.
it's a wonderful thing if you don't know anything about what's actually going on. And that's part of the goal, is to hide it from the public, because nobody wants to see that.
But I guess the question with that is, did they really have to hide it from the public when everyone was kind of wanting that with the natives? Like, you know what I'm saying?
I feel
Up
like-
until the 20th century, probably not.
They'll
Yeah.
agree
I feel
with it
like,
as long as they
That's what I
don't
was
see it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like after the turn of the century, they would have had to hide it a little better.
Mm-hmm.
And they managed to, because like you said, you know, there wasn't meaningful legislation until the 90s, basically,
Yeah.
which that blew me away too. 'Cause that-
Yeah,
That's not like 60 years ago or anything, that's,
hundreds
Yeah.
of years.
And just imagine, like, those generations have been, like, messed up. And that's why there's such a big stereotype with abusive Native American families. And alcoholism, because that's how they deal with.
no, I mean, it
That's
is,
abuse.
it is unfortunately true these days. There's
Mhm.
a problem with alcoholism, because biologically they can't handle it as well as the rest of us, and we figured that out pretty fast, and was like, yeah,
Yeah.
Definitely, when it's almost like when there's a system made to prevent you from doing good things, yeah, the stress can push.
But even relating it back to one, I don't remember what question it was, but I think it was number 2, talking about they sterilized kids in school.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they
That
didn't
was
care. They didn't care. Like, as long as the next generation was going to be non-existent,
Yeah.
they didn't care how it happened.
Like the ultimate goal is just extermination.
Yeah.
And they did it in every way, like with the environmental racism, with the like actual sterilization, with all these, they tried it.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention that in the boarding schools, of course, they weren't going to let them know what really was going on.
Yeah. Was
So-
it like what was underreported? Underreported. There was something that was really underreported. I think it was abuse or like maybe sterilization or something of the kids in the boarding school. There's something. You know what I'm talking about?
I feel like it was sterilization.
I think it was sterilization. Yeah,
it was
going back to
underreported.
yeah, like it was. They found that it was more like 75 or 80% of their communities were sterilized. Yeah, instead of the 20% they had thought it was before. Yeah, that's really messed up. Okay, what's the next question?
Was it 4?
We're on 4 now.
Okay.
No, 5.
Yeah, thanks so much.
This is another one.
Yeah.
How is environmental racism a form of violence against Indigenous peoples?
I mean, you're literally poisoning the land of specific people to avoid doing it to the more dominant group. Like
Yeah.
they said that the majority of uranium enrichment and nuclear testing is done on lands that are designated as Native American.
Right.
It was like 928 nuclear explosions have taken place on Shoshone land or
Mhm.
something, and I was like,
That, yeah.
what?
This
Because I didn't know that
particular-
either.
They also mentioned that that natives didn't properly subdue natural environment, and that it wasn't a civil right to them, which I thought was strange. They actually said Indians had not subdued it, so therefore had only a natural right to it. They had a natural right to it, but not a civil right to it. And of course, we all know civil right is more important than a natural right, I guess, to
Mhm.
people. So, yeah, I thought that was kind of,
That ideology
Strange.
is just so inconsiderate because it's like, yes, they didn't establish private property, but that's not in their culture. Just because it's in our culture doesn't mean that it's inherently going to be in this new group of people's culture to be like, I own this.
Right.
And you can't tell me that if they had established private property, we would have rolled up and respected that.
No way.
No.
It would have been like, oh, it's not under American. Like,
Yeah.
they didn't do it the right way or something.
I talked about kind of how the nuclear fallout kind of affected women, and that kind of also went hand in hand with the sterilization because the radiation was in the atmosphere, in the soil, the crops, the livestock, in the breast milk of everything, and
Right.
it had detrimental effects. The women would give birth to whatever it was that was not human. They were inviable, they didn't survive, and a lot of times the women were just infertile anyway, so that just kind of stops the lineage right there.
Yeah. They were called jellyfish babies.
I looked it up and it was terrible. I didn't recommend it.
Oh, no. It says,
Why would you do that?
Because I was curious what the one
Yeah.
without bones.
yeah, it says baby without bones. Like, what does that look like?
When they described it as a bunch of grapes, I was like,
Oh,
I kind of need to see this. Oh
I
God.
did not.
I didn't want to Google anything in this. I was
No.
like, no, I just take their word for it.
Yeah.
But it was talking about with radiation, it was saying that, especially in the Marshall Islands, which is where those
Yeah.
jellyfish babies were, that lung cancer is 4 times greater, and just generally oral cancer was 10 times greater, and more
Life
people
in-
are having miscarriages. It was just like all these different statistics, and you look at it and you think, wow, like you know someone that's had cancer, you know someone that's had a miscarriage, and just think about that in terms of like 1 in 3, which is
Entire communities.
and like an entire population of people. Like how does that even happen? And people like whoever is doing these are just not very considerate, and they are
Yeah,
doing
we-
it willingly.
You know, we knew the effects of radiation long before Hiroshima, let alone this time period. So someone somewhere knew exactly what they
Right.
were doing and exactly what the effects were going to be.
When did they do that?
Because I think when it was talking about the side effects of like the increased rates of cancer, it also talked about how the life expectancy was halved. Like
Yeah.
it was up to 40 years as opposed to, I don't know, 80.
Yeah, I was saying with those infant deaths, it was between 1954 and 58. I mean, we knew about that, especially looking after Japan. Like,
Oh, yeah.
we knew what was happening. It was like, who cares? It's just another way of genocide that no one's going to think about. But, so, the anti-violence strategy.
According to Smith, what would be an anti-violence? What would an anti-violence strategy look like?
Okay, so it was a lot.
Yeah,
This
it was a lot.
This question is actually why I ended up printing my notes.
Yeah.
Let's see. Some of the strategies, a lot. He mentioned that an issue with the strategies was that they are state friendly, such as like hiring police, giving longer sentences to rapists, passing mandatory arrest laws and stuff like that. But there's a contradiction because Native people are the most people arrested and incarcerated. So he argued that for the strategies, you need to adopt anti-violence strategies that are mindful of the larger structures of violence. It said that the strategies need to combat violence directed against communities. And this includes police brutality, prisons, militarism, racism, and they also need to address how gender violence is a tool of racism, economic oppression, colonialism, and patriarchy. Like he was pretty much saying you can't have anti-violence strategies that don't address all of those things.
I agree. I think I might have missed the mark on this one, but when I picked up,
These last two are harder than the other.
when I just like, they were talking about with sexual violence victims, how their society is more focused on like reconciliation, like making it right with the people, and instead of
Right.
incarcerating them, they just kind of make right with the society.
Yeah, I was saying that they are pressured into forgive and forget tribal mediation programs. So like, it's fine, sexual abuse is fine, like as long as it doesn't happen again, you know, just stuff like that. But another thing that was interesting was that the author really wanted people to be educated while they were in jail. So not coming out, because I mean, I think we all know at this point that criminals that go into jail and are not educated will usually come out doing the same thing. So, and even when this book was written, which I think was in the early 2000s, that she knew, hey, like if you wanted people to change their behavior, especially Native Americans, because you give them such a hard time, then it's easier to do that through education. Yeah, this book was written in 2005, so
Yeah.
it's a little bit older, but any thoughts?
On the spot now. We can move on to the next one. I didn't like that.
That was the toughest question.
Yeah,
It
it
was,
was.
because it wasn't like directly out
Yeah,
there.
it was very concentrated in different areas.
I think it was all on like one page. In a
Yeah,
paragraph.
it was
all
like
in one
it was
paragraph.
like boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah. Easy to fly past.
right.
How is the reliance on the state-based criminal justice system inadequate to address sexual violence in the Native communities? And I feel like 6 and 7 kind of
Yeah.
overlap each other.
Yeah, because I was gonna say
a
something
little.
about 6, but it really more applies to 7, so I guess I'll say it now.
Okay.
How our criminal justice system is supposed to be, like, you're supposed to be judged by a jury, a panel of your peers. And when it deals with Native Americans, it takes them from the community where their peers are and causes them to be judged by people that they would otherwise have no contact with probably and would never consider peers or like in the community. And they're gonna have a better chance of being biased against in our criminal justice system because it's built around the dominant group. So when you take them out of the community, like you said, they want to focus more on community healing. They can't do that when they're taken out, thrown in
Exactly.
jail, and that's what their punishment is.
I kind of thought that 7 was a lot different from 6. I looked at it as it stated in the reading that it was inadequate to address it because it kind of removes the option of pro-choice. So it kind of goes with 6, kind of not. No, that's strategies. But it like removes the option of pro-choice, and it marginalizes women of color, poor women, and women with disabilities. The example they gave was that marginalization narrows the advocacy to legislation that affects the right to choose whether or not to have an abortion, but like it doesn't address the condition that puts women into having to make that decision. So it kind of like, when it looks at it, it doesn't look at all of it. It kind of focuses and narrows it down to one portion.
I pretty much just kind of said almost the same thing I said for 6. Just talking about how our criminal justice system is more punitive as opposed to the Native American system, and theirs is more focused on reconciliation. I use the same metaphor as sexual violence victims,
Right.
forgive and forget,
Mhm.
et cetera, et cetera. Yes, that's all I have on that.
And another thing, and this ties, I could have said this for 6 now that I've thought about it, typical, but how one of the ways that our system works is we want to like coddle the victim and, you know, you need this, you need that, and whereas their community and a strategy like it talks about in number 6 would be more to try to include the women that have been victims of sexual assault and turn them into like activists and speakers about it and try to get them to be in a leadership to try to help stop the future of sexual assault and violence.
One of the things that the author had discussed in the book was that I think the American government felt inclined to increase the amount of police officers and to increase the amount of jails and just try to, and we've seen this a lot, especially with the war on drugs, where people are being incriminated. And since, I mean, if we tie this all back together through the whole book, it's like we see this alcoholism trend through this specific group of people, and that's going to make it more like police officers are basically going to be able to catch them more.
Yeah.
So it makes it harder, and so the idea that America is essentially thought of is the more people we imprison, the more they're going to get better, and the more we're taking crime off the streets, when we know this isn't true.
Yeah.
And it seems like the American criminal justice system essentially has no understanding of what Native American justice systems look like at all. They had no idea, and it was very rigid. Like, and even when it came down to like assault on tribal lands, it was like, well, the tribal officers can't take into custody white people because they're on tribal land, and they aren't part of the tribe. So it was like this whole thing, and so it's not very cohesive, and they could work together and make it so much better. But yeah, they definitely are kind of like on opposite ends of
Like, just because the
thinking.
presence of more police officers and more like strict laws doesn't necessarily deter or reduce the crime rates, I think I saw.
Mm-hmm.
So,
If anything, it's just going to increase it, because then you're taking people that already have a hard enough time functioning in our society, and you're giving them a criminal record, and that's going to make it even harder to find a job
yeah.
That's the
and be able to turn their lives around.
That's the same thing I was thinking. Like, honestly, it seems like it's just a system. Like, it's just a big circle that works in the way to be against those people.
Yeah.
Like,
It's
Vicious circle.
what's
Yeah.
the word
It's a
that's like
circle,
it's
cycle.
well, I guess systemic, like
I don't know.
yeah, systemic.
Circle.
A systemic circle.
Systemic circle.
That's a word. But
Any final thoughts on the book?
I mean, our general opinion, or I don't think that would be.
No?
I don't think we can talk about
We
that.
don't need to. Yeah, I mean, overall, I guess I could say the reading was interesting. It's a lot that I never thought of when it comes to Native people. I think all of the questions that we had for our discussion were very thoughtful questions. I wasn't going to do like you and look them up, that's for sure.
now
I
I
wasn't
want to
gonna look
know.
some of the stuff in this book. But it kind of almost makes me realize that, like, it's possible to stop, like, through the government, it's possible to pretty much stop any certain race from doing anything.
Yeah.
Because I was kind of shocked that that's, like, the government was allowing this stuff to happen. Like, I think in the 1970s, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare accelerated programs to pay for a majority of the cost of sterilization.
Yeah.
And I was just like, this is what the government to this
Right.
with their time and money.
Yeah.
Sterilize
Waste it.
people
Yeah.
just to prevent a race or natives or whatever from
Like,
reproducing. I thought it was
I had no idea that these problems even existed. Like, we knew about genocide and the Trail of Tears, like what we're taught in history class, but we don't hear about this,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah, about the 20th century, Native Americans kind of drop out
Yeah,
of
like you don't
history.
hear about
And I
it.
think this was a really good book to read now, because, you know, they're even more in the background now, because other groups have become like the forefront of
Right.
what's wrong with how our country treats minorities, and Native Americans have kind of just faded into the background.
It's interesting because when I was reading it, I couldn't help but think of my family because my mom's side is Native American. Like, all of my cousins on my grandmother's whole side are all Native American. So I was just reading this and I'm like, ooh, if you were alive back in this day,
Mm-hmm.
poor
Which
great
wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, it was.
No, I remember there was like a cigarette advertisement, and it was in Seneca Valley, which is funny because I'm like right from where, like I'm right near Seneca. So I know exactly what they're talking about, and they were talking about one of the advertisements where it was like, they had like these really like up there white women in like their nice clothes and whatever, and they have like normal names, and they go to the Indian women, and it's like really like stereotypical, like really messed up names. It's like, but I know exactly what they're talking about.
Like the billboards that said, "Don't let an unwanted pregnancy ruin your drug habit." I was like, really?
Wow.
That's something you feel like you can say and put on an advertisement?
But back then you can.
I mean, and that wasn't that
We
long
still
ago
could.
either.
And that was some of these things were like in our lifetime. I was like,
Yeah.
wow, God, wow.
I think that was like in the 70s or 80s that billboard was like,
That's like our parents lived in.
right?
That's
And
like,
some of these things, some things happened as recent as 2004, and I was like, oh dear God.
Yeah.
It's
And that's what I'm saying, is like Native Americans have kind of faded into the background and you don't hear a lot about it until you read something like this.
Yeah.
Alright.
I guess that concludes our discussion.